Reality feels stable, predictable, continuous. We wake up, we move through days, and we assume the world is the same world it was yesterday. But across modern history, serious researchers have explored a different possibility: that reality might be more participatory than we think. That observation, perception, and memory may not simply record the world, but help shape the experience of it. This documentary examines three subjects that are often discussed separately. First, declassified government and academic-era research into consciousness, perception, and the limits of human awareness. Second, remote viewing, the controversial attempt to gather information about distant targets without ordinary sensory contact. And third, the Mandela effect, a modern phenomenon where large groups of people share vivid memories that conflict with current records. These topics attract noise. They attract exaggeration. They attract certainty where certainty is not earned. So in this film, the approach is controlled and grounded. We will separate what is documented from what is debated. We will distinguish verified history from interpretation. And we will focus on the deeper question that sits underneath all three subjects. Is reality purely external and fixed, or is human consciousness entangled with the way reality is perceived, remembered, and experienced? Not as a claim, as a question. Because if perception can reach beyond the body, if memory can shift in patterned ways, and if institutions quietly funded research into these boundaries, then we're left with a final thought that is difficult to ignore. Maybe reality is stable most of the time, but maybe it isn't as simple as we were taught. And if that's true, the most important frontier is not a distant planet. It's the space between observation, memory, and the world we call real. To understand why governments and institutions explored unusual psychological territory, it helps to remember the atmosphere of the 20th century. The Cold War was a competition of technology, strategy, and intelligence. It was also a competition of uncertainty. Leaders worried about surprise weapons, surprise alliances, and surprise methods that could bypass conventional defense. In that environment, questions that sounded impossible were still examined, because ignoring a possibility felt riskier than investigating it. Could perception be manipulated at scale? Could stress, isolation, or suggestion change what someone believes they saw? Could misinformation be made so convincing that it becomes memory? And, at the most extreme edge of inquiry, could the human mind access information in a way that didn't depend on distance or ordinary senses? A sober interpretation is not that officials believed everything. It's that they treated some ideas like a risk assessment. If the possibility exists, even at low probability, intelligence organizations want to know. At the same time, academic research in psychology and neuroscience was expanding. Memory was no longer treated as a perfect recording. Perception was no longer treated as a simple camera. Researchers began to describe the mind as an active system, filtering, predicting, filling gaps, and reshaping experiences into coherent stories. This is where the first bridge forms between the three subjects of this film. If perception is an active construction, then it can be guided. If memory is reconstructive, then it can drift. And if consciousness itself has capabilities we don't fully understand, then what we call reality may be part external world, part internal interpretation. From here, we move to the sharp edge of the question, not what people believe, but what experiments tried to test. When people hear time experiments, they often imagine science fiction. But the real story begins with something more subtle: the limits of certainty. In everyday life, time feels like a line. Past behind us, future ahead, present moving forward like a cursor on a timeline. But in the sciences, the relationship between time, observation, and measurement becomes complicated. Even without invoking exotic claims, one stable fact remains. Observation changes systems. Sometimes that change is physical, sometimes it is psychological, sometimes it is statistical, altering what is noticed and what is ignored. In human terms, attention is not neutral. The moment you focus on something, you amplify it, you interpret it, you prioritize it, you create meaning around it. This matters because many reality anomalies are not dramatic events. They are patterns, repeated impressions, repeated mistakes, repeated shared confusions. If time and memory were perfectly rigid, these patterns would be random. But human experience is not random. It is shaped by prediction. Your brain is constantly forecasting what comes next, filling in missing detail, and smoothing contradictions. That is not a flaw. It's what allows you to function. Yet this same feature creates a vulnerability. If memory is reconstructed, then a group can reconstruct in similar ways. Shared culture, shared media, shared expectations. These can produce shared errors. So before we even reach remote viewing, we have to set a foundation. The Mandela effect does not require supernatural causes to exist as a phenomenon. The question is, what kind of phenomenon it is? And remote viewing does not require certainty to be studied. The question is whether results exceed chance under controlled conditions. This documentary will not demand one answer. It will examine the evidence, the history, and the most plausible explanations, without inflating the story beyond what it can support. Now we move into remote viewing. What it was, what it claimed, and why it remains debated. Remote viewing is often described in simple terms: perceiving a distant target without ordinary sensory access. In practice, the concept was handled more cautiously. Remote viewing sessions were structured attempts to obtain descriptions, shapes, locations, environments, or features about targets the viewer did not know. The reason this remains controversial is straightforward. If it works, even weakly, it suggests the mind can access information outside normal channels. If it doesn't work, then the results can be explained by chance, suggestion, or selective interpretation. Historically, remote viewing research drew attention because it was associated with military and intelligence interest, especially during periods when agencies feared rival breakthroughs. That alone does not prove effectiveness, but it does explain why the topic never fully disappeared. A typical session framework, in broad terms, involved a viewer in a controlled setting, a target assigned through a random or blinded method, and records kept so results could be evaluated. Supporters argue that some sessions produced striking matches, geographical features, structures, or unusual details that appeared unlikely to guess. Skeptics argue that human pattern matching is powerful, that vague descriptions can be interpreted flexibly, and that, when thousands of sessions occur, a few impressive ones are statistically inevitable. The most reasonable position is to recognize both realities. 1. Remote viewing research created enough intrigue to be studied seriously in some circles. 2. The overall reliability, repeatability, and practical utility remain disputed. So why include it here? Because even if remote viewing is partly explained by psychology, it still reveals something important. Human perception is not a passive recording. It is active, imaginative, and sensitive to expectation. And that same truth will become central when we examine the Mandela effect. Before we get there, consider one more possibility. Even if remote viewing does not transcend space, it may still demonstrate how information can be assembled from minimal cues, how a mind can build a plausible world from fragments. And if many minds do that in similar ways, we may be closer to understanding shared false memories than we realize. To understand the Mandela effect, we have to start with a hard truth. Memory is not a video file. Memory is a reconstruction. The brain stores fragments, emotional tone, key images, context, and meaning. Later, when you remember, your brain rebuilds the scene, often with high confidence. This is why two honest people can remember the same event differently. Not because one is lying, because memory prioritizes coherence over precision. Now, scale that up. If millions of people share the same cultural inputs, similar media, similar phrases, similar childhood references, then their reconstructions can converge. This creates an unusual outcome, a memory that feels personal but is actually collective. The Mandela effect is a name for moments like this, where groups report remembering a detail that doesn't match current records. What makes it powerful is the emotional certainty. People don't just think, maybe I'm wrong. They often feel, I know this happened. That feeling is real. The question is what it means. Some explanations are straightforward. Confusable names, similar logos, common misquotes, repeated parody that replaces the original. The brain favoring what sounds right over what is correct. Another factor is repetition. The more a false version is repeated socially, the more familiar it becomes. Familiarity is often mistaken for truth, but there is also a deeper layer. In a world flooded with information, memory becomes an efficiency system. It compresses reality into meaning. It stores patterns rather than details. It remembers the gist, then fills in the rest. This is where the Mandela effect becomes more than a list of examples. It becomes a window into how reality is experienced. Because what we call reality is not merely what exists, it is what is perceived, interpreted, and remembered. And when large groups experience the same interpretive drift, it can feel like reality itself shifted. Now we examine the Mandela effect more directly, what it is, why it persists, and why it connects to the same boundary questions raised by remote viewing and institutional research. The Mandela effect gained cultural momentum because it contains a paradox. The contradiction is simple. Many people remember something the same way, but the record does not match. In everyday life, when you're wrong alone. But when a large group shares the same memory, it feels different. It feels like evidence. This is why some interpret the Mandela effect as more than psychology. Some propose parallel timelines, reality edits, or shifts in the structure of the world. Those interpretations are not provable in any simple way, and without careful standards, they can turn into pure storytelling. But the emotional experience still matters because it reveals how humans evaluate truth. We often trust memory because it feels like a direct line to the past. Yet memory is a living system. It changes with time, with retelling, and with exposure to alternate versions. One of the most overlooked forces here is media environment. A quote is misheard, then repeated. A logo is redesigned subtly, then remembered as always being that way. A parody becomes more famous than the source. A concept is simplified, then taught widely. Over time, the simplified or altered version becomes the memory version. So the Mandela effect can be understood as a collision between the record and the collective memory ecosystem. And when those collide, the human mind often assumes the record must be wrong, because memory feels personal, not social. This doesn't dismiss the phenomenon. It explains its persistence, and it reveals a deeper truth. What we call reality is partly the world, and partly the story the mind tells about the world. Now, where does this intersect with remote viewing? Remote viewing suggests, at minimum, that minds can produce structured impressions under uncertainty. The Mandela effect suggests that many minds can converge on the same impression, even when it diverges from the record. Both indicate that perception and memory can create a stable experience that may not perfectly match external reality. And that brings us back to the larger question. If the mind shapes experience, then what exactly is real in the human sense? Now we connect the threads, without overstating them, into a single framework. When these subjects are examined together, a pattern becomes visible. Remote viewing sits at the edge of perception, attempting to gather impressions with minimal sensory input. The Mandela effect sits at the edge of memory, revealing how groups can share the same confident reconstruction even when records disagree. Institutional interest sits at the edge of risk, showing that agencies and researchers explored how consciousness and perception might be stretched, influenced, or measured. What ties them together is not a single conclusion. It is a single boundary, the boundary between the external world and internal experience. Most of life is lived inside that boundary. You do not experience reality directly. You experience a model of reality. That model is built from senses, yes, but also from prediction, expectation, and memory. This is why two people can witness the same moment and leave with different certainties. And this is why groups can carry the same incorrect detail with immense confidence. If you want a sober takeaway, it is this. Reality may be stable, but human experience of reality is not perfectly stable. And when people describe reality shifts, they may be describing a shift in the shared model, the collective story, rather than a literal edit to the physical world. But the existence of that shared model is itself important because it can be influenced. It can be guided by repetition. It can be shaped by narrative. It can drift over time. This is why institutions care about perception, not because it changes physics, but because it changes behavior. If you can shape what people believe they remember, you can shape what they believe is true. And if you can shape what they believe is true, you can shape the decisions they make. So the frontier is not only whether reality can be altered. The frontier is whether perception and memory can be directed, and how often that happens without being noticed. Now we close with a final reflection. What remains unknown? What remains plausible? And what this means for anyone trying to see clearly in a world of shifting narratives. So what do we conclude? Not that reality is an illusion, not that timelines are proven to split, not that remote viewing is fully validated or fully disproven. The most responsible conclusion is simpler. Human perception is powerful, but not perfectly reliable. Human memory is vivid, but not perfectly accurate. And institutions have studied the edges of these systems because the edges matter. Remote viewing, whether viewed as anomaly or psychology, demonstrates how structured impressions can be produced under uncertainty. The Mandela effect demonstrates how shared culture can produce shared memory, even when the record disagrees. And declassified research demonstrates that serious people have investigated these boundaries, sometimes quietly, sometimes imperfectly, often without public attention. If you want one practical insight from all of this, it is this. The world you live in is partly external fact and partly internal interpretation. That doesn't mean nothing is real. It means truth requires discipline. It means we must separate what we feel from what we can verify. And it means we should remain humble about certainty, especially when our certainty is built from memory. Because memory can be edited by time, by repetition, by expectation, by the stories we consume. And the greatest experiment may not be in a hidden facility. It may be the one happening every day inside the mind, where reality becomes experience, and experience becomes what we call the truth. This has been Shadow Stream. If you want the next chapter, we'll continue examining the boundaries between the visible world and the forces that shape what we believe it is. Until then, keep your attention sharp. Throughout history, certain questions never disappear. They change language, they change framing, but they return. Questions about perception, about memory, about whether human experience reflects the world as it is, or the world as it is interpreted. These questions resurface most often during periods of uncertainty, when systems change rapidly, when information expands faster than understanding. In those moments, people don't just seek facts, they seek coherence. They want to know whether what they remember still matters, whether what they perceive can be trusted, whether reality itself is stable beneath the noise. This is one reason subjects like perception research, remote viewing, and collective memory re-emerge again and again. Not because answers were settled, but because the need for orientation never is. Every era has its own version of these questions, and each time, the same tension appears between certainty and doubt. That tension is not a weakness. It is the engine of inquiry. Modern life introduces a new variable into this discussion: scale. Never before have human beings consumed this much information, this quickly, from this many sources. Images, headlines, clips, interpretations, reactions. The brain evolved to operate in environments where information was scarce and costly. Today, information is abundant and continuous. This creates a condition known as perceptual saturation. When everything competes for attention, the mind compresses aggressively. It prioritizes patterns over details, meaning over accuracy, familiarity over verification. In this environment, memory becomes more malleable, not less. Not because people are careless, but because the cognitive load is immense. This matters because when memory compresses, shared narratives become more powerful than records. And once a narrative stabilizes socially, it can override contradictory data with surprising ease, not through deception, through repetition. One of the most misunderstood aspects of memory is confidence. People often assume that strong confidence means strong accuracy. In reality, confidence measures emotional certainty, not factual precision. A memory can feel vivid, detailed, and unquestionable, while still being incomplete or altered. This is not speculation. It is a documented feature of human cognition. The mind prioritizes internal consistency. When a memory fits cleanly into a personal narrative, it feels true. And when that same memory is reinforced socially, confidence increases further. This creates a feedback loop. Confidence rises, doubt decreases, verification stops. This is how entire groups can share the same incorrect detail without ever coordinating. Not because they are manipulated, but because the system rewards coherence over contradiction. Even when remote viewing is interpreted conservatively, it still reveals something important. It shows how the human mind operates when information is incomplete. Given minimal cues, the mind does not freeze. It generates structure. It builds internal models. It fills gaps with inference. Sometimes those inferences align with reality. Sometimes they don't. But the process itself is revealing. Remote viewing, stripped of mythology, becomes a mirror of cognition under uncertainty. And that same process operates constantly in daily life. Every assumption, every expectation, every remembered detail, The mind is always assembling reality from fragments. The question is not whether this happens. The question is how often we mistake assembly for observation. When institutions funded research into perception and cognition, they were not chasing metaphysics. They were managing risk. If perception could be influenced, it mattered. If memory could be shaped, it mattered. If belief could be reinforced or destabilized, it mattered. None of this requires altering reality itself. It only requires influencing how reality is experienced. History shows that perception drives behavior more reliably than facts alone. What people believe they remember shapes what they believe is possible. And what they believe is possible shapes what they will accept, resist, or ignore. This is why the study of perception was never fringe within intelligence or psychological research. It was strategic. Reality feels stable because the mind works hard to make it feel that way. Continuity is comforting. Consistency reduces cognitive effort. So when inconsistencies appear, the mind often resolves them internally rather than questioning the external world. This creates what can be called the stability illusion, not an illusion of existence, but an illusion of permanence. The world changes constantly. Records update. Systems evolve. But the mind prefers continuity, so it edits, smooths, and reconciles differences quietly. Most of the time, this works. Occasionally, it doesn't. And when enough people experience the same mismatch, it feels like something external must have changed. This is not evidence of instability. It is evidence of how stability is maintained. Shared memory carries emotional weight. When someone says, "I remember that too," it validates personal experience. It creates belonging. That emotional reinforcement strengthens confidence and reduces skepticism. This is why shared false memories feel profound rather than trivial. They feel like confirmation of reality itself. But the power of shared memory does not come from accuracy. It comes from alignment. Alignment of expectation. Alignment of culture. Alignment of narrative. And alignment is easier than verification, especially in complex systems. Skepticism is often misunderstood as dismissal. In reality, skepticism is discipline. It is the willingness to hold uncertainty without rushing to resolution. This matters because the most dangerous errors are not the ones people question. They are the ones people stop questioning. When perception, memory, and narrative align too smoothly, doubt becomes uncomfortable. But discomfort is not a signal of falsehood. It is a signal of friction between belief and evidence. And that friction is necessary. Today, reality is experienced through layers: direct experience, media interpretation, social reinforcement, algorithmic amplification. Each layer feeds the next. This creates feedback systems where certain ideas stabilize quickly, regardless of accuracy. Once stabilized, they feel inevitable. This does not require coordination. It requires repetition, and repetition is abundant. In such systems, perception does not merely reflect reality. It participates in shaping which version of reality dominates attention. There is a temptation to seek final answers to these questions, to declare that reality is fixed, or that reality is fluid, or that memory is trustworthy, or that memory is unreliable. But human experience resists simple conclusions. The most honest position is not certainty. It is calibration. Knowing when confidence is warranted. Knowing when doubt is necessary. Knowing when memory should be checked rather than trusted. Reality does not collapse under scrutiny. Only assumptions do. When perception, memory, and narrative intersect, the result is not illusion. It is experience. And experience is powerful. not because it defines reality, but because it defines how reality is lived. The greatest influence is rarely hidden technology or secret experiments. It is the quiet shaping of what people notice, remember, and repeat. So the most important skill is not belief or disbelief. It is attention. Attention to how certainty forms. Attention to how memory feels. Attention to how narratives stabilize. Because the world does not ask for blind trust. It asks for awareness. This has been Shadow Stream, and the boundary remains between what exists and what we experience as real. There is another layer to this discussion that rarely receives attention. Not the question of whether memory can fail, but why the mind works so hard to prevent noticing when it does. The human mind is not designed to preserve raw data. It is designed to preserve meaning. When experiences are encoded, the mind stores what mattered emotionally, not what was precise factually. Details that do not support meaning are often trimmed away. Details that reinforce coherence are strengthened. This is not deception. It is efficiency. The brain evolved under conditions where speed mattered more than accuracy. A fast interpretation could save a life. A perfect one often arrived too late. So the system favors plausibility over precision. This explains why memories feel true even when they drift. Because they preserve the story, not the record. And stories are easier to carry than facts. When societies scale, this same mechanism scales with them. Individual memories blend into shared narratives. Shared narratives harden into cultural memory. At that point, correction becomes difficult, not because evidence is unavailable, but because correction threatens identity. If a memory supports belonging, questioning it can feel like exclusion. If a narrative supports stability, challenging it can feel dangerous. So the system resists change quietly. This resistance does not require authority. It emerges naturally from alignment. The more people share a version of events, the more real it feels. The more real it feels, the less verification seems necessary. This is why historical debates rarely resolve cleanly. They are not only about evidence, they are about which version of the past people are willing to live with. Memory, once socialized, becomes emotional infrastructure. The same dynamics apply to perception itself. Perception is not passive. It is predictive. The brain constantly anticipates what it is about to see, hear, or experience. Incoming information is filtered through expectation before awareness even begins. When perception aligns with expectation, the experience feels smooth. When it doesn't, the mind often adjusts perception rather than revising belief. This happens automatically, instantly, without conscious intent. It is why two people can witness the same event and remember different outcomes. Not because one is lying, but because each brain resolved ambiguity differently. Over time, those resolutions feel like observation, and observation, once believed, becomes memory. This does not mean reality is fragile. It means experience is layered. Reality exists. Perception interprets. Memory preserves. Narrative explains. Problems arise only when these layers are confused. When interpretation is mistaken for observation. When memory is mistaken for record. When narrative is mistaken for fact. The solution is not distrust. It is discernment. Knowing which layer you are operating in. Knowing when certainty is earned. Knowing when curiosity should replace confidence. Because reality does not demand belief. It tolerates scrutiny. And the most resilient understanding is not rigid certainty, but informed awareness. As information density increases, the way memory forms begins to change. Not because human cognition is weaker than it once was, but because the environment it operates in is radically different. In earlier eras, information arrived slowly. Stories traveled by word of mouth. Records were scarce. Contradictions took time to surface. Today, information arrives continuously. Images, headlines, clips, opinions, and interpretations overlap before the mind has time to resolve them. This creates a condition where memory is shaped less by direct experience and more by repetition. What appears most often begins to feel most familiar. What feels most familiar begins to feel most accurate. In this environment, the mind doesn't fail. It adapts. It compresses. It prioritizes coherence. It fills gaps with patterns that feel consistent rather than patterns that are verified. This is not deception. It is efficiency. The mind is not designed to archive reality like a hard drive. It is designed to create a usable model of the world. And when signals conflict, the model favors stability over precision. This is where shared memory begins to drift, not because facts disappear, but because attention fragments. When millions of people encounter the same simplified version of a story, memory aligns around the version that requires the least cognitive effort to maintain. Details fade, edges smooth, contradictions are filtered out. And once that version becomes socially reinforced, it gains momentum. The memory doesn't just persist, it stabilizes. At that point, correction becomes difficult, not because people are unwilling to learn, but because changing the memory would require dismantling a structure that already feels complete. This is how collective certainty forms without coordination. And this is why modern memory errors often feel deeply real. Certainty feels safe. It reduces ambiguity. It lowers cognitive load. It creates a sense of orientation in an otherwise complex environment. From a psychological standpoint, certainty is calming, even when it is incomplete. This is why belief systems, narratives, and simplified explanations spread more easily than nuanced ones. They offer closure, but closure is not the same as truth. In complex systems, early closure can be dangerous, not because it is false, but because it halts inquiry. When perception, memory, and narrative align too smoothly, skepticism begins to feel disruptive rather than necessary. Questions feel uncomfortable. Doubt feels destabilizing. Re-examination feels unnecessary. This is where the illusion of control emerges. If reality feels stable, predictable, and well understood, people feel oriented, even if that understanding is partially constructed. But when cracks appear, when memories don't match records, when perceptions diverge, when shared assumptions no longer align, discomfort follows. And the immediate instinct is not to question the system. It is to question reality itself. This is why moments of collective mismatch feel so powerful. They create the sensation that something external has shifted, even when the shift occurred internally. Not because people are irrational, but because the mind is designed to protect coherence. Once a model of reality feels complete, it resists revision. Not aggressively, quietly. It edits, it rationalizes, it substitutes. And when enough people experience the same substitutions, the experience becomes communal. At that point, disagreement feels like denial, and correction feels like threat. This is not evidence of manipulation. It is evidence of alignment. Alignment between expectation, narrative, and memory. And alignment, once achieved, is extraordinarily resilient. The challenge, then, is not deciding what is real. It is deciding how much certainty is warranted. True inquiry does not eliminate uncertainty. It manages it. It holds space between belief and evidence, between memory and record, between perception and verification. This space is uncomfortable, but it is necessary, because reality does not collapse under scrutiny. Only assumptions do. And when assumptions collapse, the sensation can feel like loss, even when it is progress. The most stable systems are not the ones that eliminate doubt. They are the ones that integrate it. They allow revision. They permit recalibration. They acknowledge limits without surrendering coherence. This is where clarity emerges, not from answers, but from posture. A posture that remains open, alert, adaptive. So when memories diverge, when narratives shift, when reality feels less solid than expected, the question is not whether something changed. The question is whether the system interpreting it remained flexible enough to notice. Because the most important frontier is not hidden. It is internal, and it is active every moment we observe, remember, and decide what we believe. This has been Shadow Stream, and the investigation does not end here. It sharpens. There is a natural desire to resolve uncertainty, to name it, to explain it, to close the loop. But resolution always comes at a cost. Once an explanation is accepted, alternative interpretations become harder to see. Attention narrows. Inquiry slows. This is not failure. It is how cognition conserves energy. The mind prefers finished models over open questions. Not because finished models are always correct, but because they are easier to live inside. And the more complex the world becomes, the more attractive simple resolution feels. This is why ambiguous phenomena generate such powerful reactions. They resist closure. They remain incomplete. They refuse to settle. And when something refuses to settle, it exposes the tension between curiosity and comfort, between wanting to know and wanting things to feel stable. That tension is uncomfortable, but it is also productive, because it is in unresolved space that assumptions are tested, that frameworks are examined, that perception becomes visible to itself. Not everything needs an answer, but everything worth understanding needs room to breathe. Doubt is often misunderstood. It is not the absence of belief. It is the suspension of premature certainty. Doubt does not weaken understanding. It refines it. In stable systems, doubt functions quietly. It adjusts expectations. It recalibrates memory. It keeps perception responsive rather than rigid. When doubt disappears entirely, systems become brittle. They resist correction. They mistake consistency for accuracy. This is why healthy inquiry does not aim for total confidence. It aims for proportional confidence. Confidence that expands when evidence supports it. Confidence that contracts when contradictions appear. This balance is rare, and it requires restraint, because the strongest impulse is not to question, it is to conclude. But conclusions end movement. Questions sustain it. And in a world where information never stops arriving, the ability to remain open without becoming lost may be the most important cognitive skill of all. Not knowing is not failure, it is a position. And sometimes, it is the most honest one available. Stability is often mistaken for truth. When something feels consistent, it feels reliable. When it feels reliable, it feels real. But consistency can be manufactured, reinforced, repeated. And repetition does not require intent. It only requires exposure. This is why perception cannot be separated from environment, from context, from expectation. The mind does not passively receive reality. It actively assembles it. And once an assembly works, once it produces coherence, it is rarely questioned. Not because it is flawless, but because it is functional. Reality, as experienced, is not optimized for accuracy. It is optimized for continuity. Understanding this does not destabilize the world. It explains why the world feels stable even when interpretations shift beneath the surface. The point is not to decide what is ultimately true. The point is to notice how truth is constructed, how memory fills gaps, how narratives stabilize uncertainty, how confidence grows not from proof, but from alignment. When these mechanisms are visible, belief becomes adjustable, not fragile, not rigid, but responsive. This is where inquiry lives, not in certainty, not in denial, but in calibration. Because seeing clearly does not mean seeing perfectly. It means knowing when to pause, when to question, and when to leave space for what is not yet resolved.